Let's talk about flowcharts and sequences that you're going to use to contain all the activities your robot will perform. I'll start by creating a new blank project, and the name doesn't really matter, but I'll call it flowcharts and sequences. I'll shrink down some of these windows to create a little bit of space. And UiPath itself recommends that the very top level of your robot should pretty much always start with a flowchart. Flowcharts are the way that people tend to visualize processes, so it's nice when the first screen of your robot is a flowchart that shows that process. So if you wanted to do that, you could either open up this available node here, and then make sure that you don't have any filter criteria up here at the top. I'll just delete that. And now notice I have all these nodes of my available activities. For sequences and flowcharts, you would go into the workflow node and use either control flow, sequence, or flowchart. Those are the activities you would use. However, the fastest way to get to them is to use this search filter, type in flowchart, and you can see that it automatically filters down and highlights the flowchart here. And the same goes for sequence. When you type that in, it highlights both sequence in favorites and sequence under workflow. These are both the same thing. The favorites node just gives you a few of the favorites that you use frequently. And you can right-click on any activity and add it to favorites to put it up there. So if I start with a sequence, it's just this box, and it allows me to put other activities inside here. So if I drag something in like open browser, you can see that that activity is here, and it also has a sequence inside it by default called do. And if I type in click up here, you can see that under UI automation element mouse click, I could drag this guy down right there within the context of this sequence. And any of these activities can be renamed by simply clicking in this top left portion here and renaming it to whatever you want. So all of these things can be renamed. So this process is going to start here and then go to this activity and any nested activities inside of that activity. And when this one has completely executed, it will move on to the next activity down here. So that's generally how sequences work, and you can nest sequences within sequences, and if you wanted to, you could even put a flowchart inside of any sequence node you want to. So now we have a flowchart inside of a sequence which is nested in additional sequences. So that's what the process looks like if you use sequences. So you can see that you wind up with this vertically stacked procedural flow of sequences and potentially embedded flowcharts. So let's right-click on this to delete it and start with a flowchart instead. So since I dragged a flowchart on, I've got this start node by default. And now what I can do is do pretty much the same thing and drag activities on like open browser and maybe mouse click. So by default with a flowchart, these things are not going to run. What I need to do is either right-click on one of these things, and you can't see it, but there's an item called Set as Start Node. And when I do that, you can see that it connects my start to that first one. If I click on that and delete it, I can right-click on this one and say Set as Start Node. And notice the start links to this one and skips over this one. The other way that I can string these together, if I click on this and delete it, is I can simply hover over any node, and you can see that those 4 little portal outputs appear, and I can simply click there and drag an arrow out and let go. So now my start is going to this one. I could have done that same thing by hovering over this, clicking here, and dragging down to this input portal, and wiring them up that way. Of course, you can come out of any one of these portals that you want to, and hook things up. So generally speaking, the way you connect these things is drag and drop here, then drag and drop here, and so on. You get the idea. And of course, once you wire these things up, you'll click on them and you'll edit their various properties over here in this window. Now I can come along and I can put a sequence in down here. So my flowchart can either consist of atomic activities or these sequence containers, which will in turn contain more activities. I can drag and select these activities. I can Control X and then double click inside here in my sequence and then paste those into this sequence. So now to get back to my flowchart level, you can see I've got this breadcrumb trail. I can simply click on flowchart And now my sequence is the only thing I see as part of my flowchart, and I can rename this as subprocess 1, right click and say set as start node, and then repeat that process as necessary. And again, as I showed before, if you double click inside here, you can string together any number of activities and or sequences and or flowcharts within a sequence, or you could even put another flowchart out here in your flowchart. So now this top level flowchart contains a subprocess sequence and then moves along after that into a flowchart. And if you double click in here, you've got another start node and you can drag in more sequences or flowcharts or activities accordingly. So as you can see, this little outline panel over here gives you a nice ability to be able to navigate through those various nested activities. To get back to the root of your main.xaml file, simply click on main and zoom out a little bit, and you're back to the top level of your robot. Now, one thing that I'll mention for those of you who understand already what exception handling is, and specifically try-catch, I'll mention that even though UiPath recommends that you start with a flowchart out here on the top level, you can't apply try-catch exception handling on a top-level flowchart. Try-catch is actually an activity. If you type in try here, you can see under error handling you've got try-catch. And if you drag that on, it's an activity, and it's really an enhanced sequence. And this particular sequence here, once you're inside of it, has a block where you can try something and then catch any exceptions and act accordingly. Plus there's a finally that will always execute. And inside here, you would simply drag in sequences or flowcharts or activities, the same way we talked about before. So as you can see out here on main, there's really no way for me to wrap this entire flowchart here inside of a try-catch. So instead of starting with a flowchart as my top-level entity or activity, what I might find myself doing is first dragging on a try-catch and naming that accordingly, try the whole process, and now we've got this try block in here, and we can grab a flowchart and toss that inside and rename this to something like the process. So I found myself leaning in this direction where I can have this flowchart or sequence inside this try block, and if anything goes wrong, I can have a catch down here to gracefully handle any failures instead of letting the robot just completely crash. In future lectures, I'll talk about this try-catch process in more detail, and then you can make a determination whether you want to use a try-catch at the root of your robot or just start with a flowchart like UiPath recommends.